There's a truth that most people spend their lives avoiding. A truth too sharp for comfort, too sacred for casual conversation. The truth is this: every genuine transition in life demands a price. Not a symbolic price, not a poetic one, a real one. And that price is almost always paid in the currency of crisis. Not because life is cruel, but because transformation is sacred, and the soul does not evolve through convenience. We imagine that growth is linear, that we decide to change, and so we do. That the next chapter begins when we're ready. But change, true change, the kind that alters your identity, rewires your instincts, dissolves your masks, does not wait for your permission. It does not ask if you're prepared. It arrives like a storm. It tears things down. It disrupts your order. And in that disruption, something dies. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He saw transformation not as self-improvement, but as psychic death. The death of the old story. The death of ego as ruler. The death of who you thought you were. And that death never comes gently. It comes through friction, through unraveling, through crisis. Not all crises are visible. Some look like silence, like withdrawal, like nothing at all. But beneath the surface, something is breaking open. Something is refusing to be held together by the threads of your former self. This is where the work begins. Not in fixing, but in allowing. In watching everything you thought was stable begin to fall apart. We resist this. Of course we do. We cling to routines, to identities, to the familiar weight of suffering. We tell ourselves we're not ready, not strong enough, not sure. But life has its own timing. And when it's time to move to a new stage, it doesn't negotiate. It cracks you open. And it's in the cracking that the soul begins to speak. It doesn't speak in comfort. It doesn't hand you a map. It offers you loss, uncertainty, the pulling away of what no longer serves you, sometimes gently, often not. You may lose people, opportunities, desires, parts of yourself that once felt essential. And each loss will feel like failure. But in truth, it's an opening, because the soul is not interested in comfort. It's interested in truth. And the truth is, you cannot carry your old self into your new life. That is the price. We talk about wanting to evolve, to heal, to awaken, but we rarely speak about the cost. We rarely admit that growth feels like grief, that it requires surrendering what kept you safe, that it asks you to let go before knowing what will take its place. And in that void, fear rushes in. Panic, silence, the urge to go back, to rebuild the old, to re-identify with something, anything, that keeps you from floating in uncertainty. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to retreat, something else begins to rise. First pain, then confusion, then anger. But beneath them all, clarity. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of presence. The clarity of being stripped down to what's real, to what's left when there's nothing left to perform. This is the beginning of a new stage. Not a grand entrance, not a ceremony, a whisper, a breath, a moment of recognition. I am not who I was. I may not yet know who I'm becoming, but I can no longer pretend to be asleep. And from there, something starts to rebuild, slowly, organically, from inside out. You begin to feel your own weight differently. You speak with less noise. You make decisions from the body, not the fear. You no longer crave the validation of the world because you've walked through the fire and your worth was forged in that silence. But this doesn't happen overnight. The crisis is not a single event. It's a series of small deaths, each one removing a layer, a belief, a role, a lie, and each one feels like loss. But underneath the loss is freedom. Not the freedom to become anything, but the freedom to be what you already are without the conditioning that buried it. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." This is that pain. The pain of unmasking. The pain of no longer pretending. The pain of letting go of what almost worked, what almost fit, what almost made you whole but never did. And the more you resist it, the longer it lasts. But the moment you say yes, not with your mouth, but with your bones, the process begins to move through you, not against you. You're not being punished. You're being realigned. This is the architecture of the psyche. It breaks to be rebuilt. It falls to reveal the foundation. And what you find at the bottom is never a broken version of you. It's the blueprint of who you were meant to become. But it costs. It always costs. And maybe no one told you that. Maybe you were promised that awakening would feel like light and love and certainty. But Jung didn't promise that. He told the truth. That individuation, the becoming of the self, is a descent before it is a rise. A dissolution before it is clarity. A crisis before it is calm. So if everything is falling apart, you are not failing. You are transitioning. And if it hurts, that means it's working. Because you cannot build a new stage while still living on the old one. You must burn what no longer serves. You must grieve the identity you outgrew. You must hold yourself in the fire long enough to let the old melt, and the new begin to take form silently in the ashes. This is not a metaphor. This is a process. This is a rite. And it begins not when you're ready, but when your soul says, now. And if you're reading this, you've already stepped in. And when you've already stepped in, when the fire's already lit beneath everything you used to lean on, the first thing you begin to feel is resistance. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that pulls from underneath. Quietly, constantly from the inside out. As if something within you is trying to hold onto the familiar, even while it's disintegrating in your hands. That's the first price. The tension of knowing that what you are no longer fits, but also not yet knowing what you are becoming. You try to keep the old structures alive. You revisit conversations that no longer nourish you. You put on the mask that once kept you safe. You speak in patterns that used to make sense. But something doesn't land the way it used to. It all tastes like paper now. The flavor of your former self has dulled. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you've already shifted. And the space between who you were and who you're becoming stretches further each day. This stretch is unbearable, because in it, you begin to feel what you must leave behind. Not just things or people, but aspects of your identity. Roles you've lived in for years, sometimes decades. The reliable rhythm of your defenses. The performance of being okay. You sense their weight, and then you start to see the cracks in them. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. That's the beginning of grief. Not because you've lost something, but because you know you will. Carl Jung wrote that individuation requires us to confront everything we've disowned, everything that no longer serves the development of the self. And when that confrontation begins, the cost rises. You begin to understand that you can't bring the old self with you into the next stage. Not because it was bad, but because it was incomplete. The people who knew that version of you, the ones who resonated with that frequency, start to feel further away. Not because of drama, simply because something inside you no longer meets them in the same place. You smile, you nod, but something doesn't connect. They speak from an old map, and you're no longer on that terrain. The connection flickers, and you start to feel guilty, as if you've changed too much, too fast. But the soul doesn't evolve according to comfort. It evolves according to necessity. Letting go of relationships, not out of resentment, but out of alignment, is one of the most painful costs of transition. You'll want to stay. You'll want to maintain. But the part of you that's already broken through cannot pretend. You may try to explain. You may even apologize. But explanation does not translate frequency. They won't understand, and they're not meant to. Not because they're less, but because they're not on the same stage of the spiral. And then there's the loss of inner language. You begin to notice how much of your inner dialogue was shaped by fear, by urgency, by trying to hold things together. And when those structures dissolve, you're left in the raw silence of your own voice. Not the one that speaks for survival, the one that waits, the one that only whispers when it's sure you'll listen. That's another cost, the absence of noise. You don't know who you are without it, so the silence feels like emptiness. But that emptiness is actually space, the beginning of presence, the beginning of honesty. And honesty cuts. It reveals the ways you betrayed your own intuition to stay comfortable. It shows you the habits you defended that were slowly draining your soul. It strips away your excuses. And what's left is you, without armor, without deflection, without performance. That's what a crisis really is. A rupture in the illusion. A moment when the false can no longer hold its form. But the mind hates this. It rushes to rebuild. It says, you're losing everything. It floods you with panic. And the temptation to run back into the burning house is almost irresistible. But you've already outgrown the floorboards. You feel in your skin. You feel it in your breath. The price has already been paid. You just haven't stopped reaching for the receipt. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the body begins to react. Fatigue, numbness, restlessness. You're not just changing mentally. Your nervous system is recalibrating. You're no longer wired to survive. You're learning how to inhabit. But that learning is not intellectual. It's visceral, and it's slow. So slow that it feels like nothing's happening. But every moment you remain in this discomfort, without escaping, without distracting, you are rewiring something ancient. The self doesn't rush. It doesn't perform. It waits until you're quiet enough to hear it. And in that quiet, you begin to feel a strange kind of mourning. Not just for what you're losing, but for how long you held on to it. For how long you convinced yourself that almost enough was love. That barely alive was safety. That not quite me was the best you could do. You mourn not because you were wrong, but because now you know better. And knowing carries weight. It's easy to fantasize about growth when it's wrapped in language like elevation and alignment. But in reality, growth often looks like confusion, like withdrawal, like doubt. You wake up not knowing what matters anymore. You stop being able to explain yourself, not just to others, but to yourself. And still, you keep going. That's what makes this stage sacred. Not that it's easy, but that it asks everything of you. And still, you stay. There is no clarity yet, no grand realization, only dissonance, only fragments. You're between names, between paths, between lives. And the price you're paying is not just what you're losing, but what you're no longer pretending to be. You are not breaking. You are shedding. You are not failing. You are unfolding. And this ache, the one that lives beneath your ribs, the one that pulses in the background of everything, that is your becoming. Not loud, not beautiful, but real. You keep moving forward, but everything in you wants to stop. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because nothing seems to respond anymore. The world feels distant. The things that used to give you joy now feel thin, colorless. Even the pain that used to define your patterns has gone quiet. And that silence is more unnerving than the pain itself. It's as if life has gone dim, and no one warned you this is what change would feel like. Not explosive, but muted. This is the moment when the real crisis begins. Not the outer one that may have already passed. The relationships may have ended. The job may have collapsed. The self-image may already be broken. But this is the inner crisis, the one that doesn't shout. The one that lives in your bones. The crisis of not knowing who you are without your suffering. The crisis of not being able to go back and still not knowing how to go forward. Carl Jung spoke of this space, psychological liminality, a threshold between two modes of being. He understood that before any new stage of consciousness can form, The old must dissolve completely. But no one tells you what that dissolution actually feels like. No one tells you how much emptiness it carries, or how still you have to become to even begin sensing where it's taking you. At first, you try to fill it with action, with answers, with rituals, with words. But the silence eats through every distraction. And the more you try to rebuild, the more exhausted you become. Because nothing sticks, nothing holds. The ground won't settle, and your hands can't grip what isn't there anymore. You begin to feel like a stranger to yourself. Familiar features, but unfamiliar motivations. You're inside your life, but no longer inside your role. This is the point where many retreat. Not out of weakness, but out of fear, because this space is too vast. It doesn't offer validation. It doesn't give clear signs. It doesn't even reward patience. It just stands there, waiting, and inside that waiting, you start to notice everything you once ignored, the patterns you brushed off, the truths you half suspected but never said aloud, the way you held yourself together with tension and called it strength. Now the tension is gone, and with it, the illusion of control. There's a numbness that sets in, but it's not apathy. It's a nervous system no longer defending what doesn't exist. You're not disconnected, you're stripped. Your reflexes aren't gone, they're exposed. Every old response begins to feel forced, and every attempt at becoming feels dishonest. You're not lazy, you're in psychic recovery. And your soul refuses to move until the movement is real. But the world doesn't understand this. It expects you to bounce back, to explain yourself, to perform healing like a checklist, to smile and say you're growing. But growth doesn't always look like light. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like disengagement, like not being able to pretend anymore. And this too is part of the cost. The distance between your inner world and outer expectations. You start to feel alone, not because you're unloved, but because no one can walk this part with you. They can sit near, they can listen, but they cannot interpret the language your soul is now speaking. That language is made of silence, of tension, of strange dreams, of subtle intuitions that rise and vanish before they make sense. It's a language that the old self never learned to read. So you stay in the space between. And this space is both terrifying and sacred. It's where time stretches, where the past no longer pulls and the future hasn't formed, where the mind wants to calculate, but the heart is too tired to imagine. You don't even have the energy to desire. That's what surprises you most. You don't want to become someone better. You just want to be someone real. And slowly you begin to feel what real might be. Not as a clear vision, but as a different kind of presence. You stop seeking what you used to chase. You stop engaging in arguments you used to win. You stop proving what no longer needs proof. And though the world may think you're withdrawing, you know something else is happening. You're waiting for your truth to return to you. Not in words, but in rhythm. It's not motivation you're missing. It's resonance. The alignment between who you are and what you do, between what you feel and what you say, between how you move and what your soul needs. And until that alignment returns, the emptiness stays. But Jung's work offers a quiet assurance. The self will not abandon you. It may disappear from the ego's view. It may go silent to protect itself from distortion, but it never leaves. It waits beneath the rubble, beneath the noise, beneath the desire to become something. It waits to be felt again. The cost of change isn't just what you lose. It's what you can no longer fake. And the truth is, you've been shedding layers that once made you functional. Layers that kept you acceptable. Layers that allowed you to survive in systems that never saw you fully. And without them, there's a rawness, a sensitivity, a vulnerability that doesn't know where to land. You don't need clarity right now. You need permission to not know, to not push, to not pretend. You need the space to let the dust settle. And that space is the most radical thing you can give yourself. Because that space is where the self grows. Not like a plant, like a pattern, like a breath that eventually becomes a voice. This voice will not shout. It will not arrive with slogans or solutions. It will rise like instinct, like knowing without thought. And when it does, you will begin again. But not because you're ready, because you're empty enough to be filled by what's real. So you wait, and in that waiting, you pay the price. Not with effort, not with discipline, with surrender. And that surrender, quiet, reluctant, aching, is the gate. Not to the next version of your life, to the life that's been waiting all along. At some point, you stop asking when it will be over. Not because it doesn't hurt anymore, but because some quiet part of you has started to understand this isn't just something you're going through. This is something that's reshaping you from the inside out. Not a detour, but the path itself. And the crisis, the wait, the silence, they're not obstacles. They're the very material your next self is being built from. That's the part no one says out loud. The breaking isn't a problem. It's the alchemy. Carl Jung never spoke of healing as a return to wholeness in the way most people imagine. Peaceful, complete, comfortable. He spoke of it as an encounter with everything unconscious, everything exiled, everything you denied in order to stay functional. The process isn't about becoming something new. It's about remembering what you buried. And remembering has a cost, because you didn't bury those parts lightly. You buried them to survive. You silenced your grief so you could keep moving. You softened your rage so you could be accepted. You numbed your knowing so you could belong. And now, as you come closer to your truth, those buried parts rise, not to punish you, but to ask if you're ready to carry what you once abandoned. This is why it has to break first, because you can't carry that depth in a structure built to hold a performance. You can't integrate your shadow into a life shaped by avoidance. You can't receive truth with hands still clinging to illusion. So the crisis comes, and it strips you bare, not out of cruelty, but because the soul knows what's real, and it won't let you build on anything false anymore. And yet, we resist. Of course we do. The ego wants coherence, even if it's built on lies. It wants a clear identity, a role, a plan, but the self doesn't speak in roles. It speaks in symbols, instincts, silence. It waits for you to empty out, to collapse inward, so that it can take up space again. Not with concepts, but with presence. And presence is unbearable when you've lived your whole life avoiding yourself. So it feels like you're dying, but you're not. You're being rewired. You stop finding meaning in the places you used to. Conversations feel flat. Ambitions lose flavor. Even spiritual language feels like noise. You look for something to hold on to, a new teacher, a new framework, a new practice, but none of it lands. Because what's coming alive in you doesn't want to be interpreted. It wants to be lived, and you can't live it from your head. This is when the internal pressure begins to rise. Not a call to act, a call to stop acting, to stop performing healing, to stop trying to skip the ache, to stop narrating your evolution before it's complete, and most of all, to stop asking for a shortcut. You want to be free, but freedom isn't light. It's honest. It's the moment you tell the truth so deeply that even your body believes you. It's the decision to no longer abandon your knowing, even if it costs you approval, even if it costs you momentum, even if it costs you everything that was once your identity. And it will, because truth is heavy at first, not because it's wrong, but because you're not used to holding it yet. So the body breaks down, the patterns unravel, the momentum stops, not because you're lost, but because you're being reformed at a level the mind can't track. You begin to see how much of your past was constructed on fear, on urgency, on trying to earn something that was never yours to chase in the first place. Jung understood that the psyche contains its own intelligence. that it knows what to dissolve, what to confront, what to drag into the light. And when you enter this liminal zone, the space between what has died and what has not yet emerged, the psyche goes to work. Not with your consent, but with your soul's. And that work is messy. You feel like you're disappearing. Because you are. At least the version of you that was built for survival. And what's left is raw, unsure but alert. The senses come online, not to detect danger, but to feel truth. You start to notice what drains you, not in theory, but in your breath. You feel when someone's words don't match their energy. You sense what's collapsing, even if no one has named it yet. You become sensitive in ways that make the old life unlivable. And still you grieve it. You miss the person you were, the one who could keep moving, keep pushing, keep pretending. The one who believed the stories, who found safety in the performance, who knew what to say, what to chase, what to want. That version was not bad. It got you here. It carried you through everything you weren't ready to feel. But it cannot come with you now, because what's coming cannot be faked. It doesn't respond to appearances. It doesn't care about potential. It doesn't rise for strategy. It moves through alignment, through integrity, through quiet. That's what makes this moment sacred. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's real. And real is rare. Most people go their whole lives avoiding this part. They stop at the edge. They rebuild fast. They create a new story, a new identity, a new self, just similar enough to the old one to feel safe, but different enough to call it transformation. And that's fine. The psyche allows that. But the soul keeps waiting for the moment you're finally willing to pay the full price. To stop patching and let the structure fall. You're in that fall now. And even though everything in you wants it to be over, wants clarity, energy, motivation, what you really need is silence. Because that silence is how the new self announces itself. Not with a roar, with a presence. You feel in glimpses, in stillness, in a strange absence of pretending. You won't go back, and you don't need to rush forward. Because something in you is already moving, slowly, faithfully, without performance. You're not healing anymore. You're becoming. Eventually, something inside you stops flinching, not because the pain is gone, but because you're no longer shocked by its presence. The silence no longer feels like failure. It feels like a kind of truth. A new rhythm begins to settle under your skin. There's no grand insight. No lightning, just a different way of carrying yourself through the same moments. And without realizing it, you've started to grow roots in this unfamiliar ground. You begin to understand that the crisis was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to mature you. Not in the superficial sense of getting over it, but in the deep, interior way of shedding the fantasy that things will return to how they were. That you will somehow go back to a version of yourself untouched by this fire. You won't, and that's the point. Carl Jung viewed transformation as a confrontation with reality, with all of its tension, paradox, and unpredictability. He saw that psychic growth was never about solving life's contradictions, but about learning to carry them. And that's what begins to happen now. You stop waiting for clean lines. Stop demanding resolution. You begin to hold two things at once: grief and gratitude, stillness and movement, clarity and confusion. You begin to accept that complexity is not a flaw. It's a sign that you're alive. But there's something more subtle that happens here, something almost invisible. You stop needing life to give you answers. You stop interpreting every discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. You don't bypass pain, but you also don't dramatize it. You witness it. You breathe with it. You allow it to rise, crest, and fall without losing your center. And this, more than anything, is the mark of someone who has crossed the threshold of crisis into something resembling grounded transformation. This groundedness isn't loud. It's not about confidence or control. It's about coherence, about finally aligning your inner life with your outer movement. You no longer act from fragmentation. You respond from integration. Even when you don't have words for what's happening, your body knows. Your timing adjusts. Your energy filters more intentionally. You start to live with boundaries that don't need explanation. You realize now that the self you used to protect no longer needs defending. Not because you've become invincible, but because you've become real. And what is real doesn't demand performance. It demands presence. You've paid the price. You've walked through the undoing. And what has remained is not someone stronger, but someone truer. The world won't always see this. From the outside, it may look like you've slowed down, that you've lost interest, that you're quieter, more distant, less ambitious. But that's only because the noise is gone. The inner negotiation, the constant justification, the addiction to striving, it's all been cleared. And what's left doesn't crave applause. It craves alignment. That alignment becomes your new compass. Not goals, not shoulds, not even vision boards or future selves. Just alignment. You feel it somatically. When you speak from it, there's no aftertaste of regret. When you step into it, your nervous system stays steady. When you violate it, your body tells you immediately. This is the maturity that can only come through crisis. Not because it's earned, but because it's chosen over and over in the dark. It's easy to talk about wholeness. Much harder to live it when it asks you to release every crutch, every disguise, every comfort you once clung to. But now you know, there's no going back. And more importantly, you don't want to. Not because the past was wrong, but because it was incomplete. And now you're learning to live without completion, to be a work in motion without shame. You feel it in the way you no longer explain your boundaries, in how you trust your discomfort, in how you don't chase what doesn't meet you, in how you no longer betray your knowing just to avoid the discomfort of silence. The self, as Jung described it, begins to operate more freely now, not because you've fully arrived, but because enough of the false layers have fallen. Enough of the ego's scaffolding has collapsed. There's space now, and space is the soul's favorite condition. In that space, intuition moves differently. You don't grasp for insight, you receive it. You don't force expression, it flows. And what returns is not the old motivation, but a kind of sacred movement, a slow, steady forwardness that has nothing to prove, that doesn't need to be fast or impressive or urgent. It just is. Like breath, like presence, like gravity. You begin to trust the quiet. You begin to sense what's yours and what isn't. You no longer try to carry what isn't yours, emotionally, energetically, psychically. You notice when someone projects. You feel it when someone isn't listening. And you don't internalize any of it. Not because you're closed, but because you're rooted. And rootedness, after crisis, is earned. The people who meet you here, they feel it. They speak slower. They listen deeper. They don't pull at your energy. They don't demand access. They meet you in the middle, or not at all. And you're okay with that. Because now, emptiness doesn't scare you. Silence doesn't signal abandonment. Space doesn't mean something's wrong. These are your allies now. They hold you where chaos once ruled. This is the transformation you couldn't see from the beginning, when everything was falling apart and the future felt blank. You didn't know that the absence was preparation, that the unraveling was sacred, that the waiting was necessary. But now you carry it, not perfectly, but consciously. You don't collapse at the first sign of discomfort. You pause, you stay, you breathe, and breath, when you've come this far, is everything. Not because it fixes, but because it reminds that you're still here, still becoming, still listening to the quiet rhythm that brought you through the fire. not to be saved, but to be changed. By now, something irreversible has taken place. Not a dramatic change, no fireworks, no visible turning point, but an internal shift so fundamental it's almost invisible to anyone but you. You no longer orbit the same fears. You no longer belong to the same illusions. You've passed through something, and though you can't always describe it, you know you didn't come out the same. There's still uncertainty. There always will be. But now it's not something to solve. It's something you know how to live with. It's no longer a threat. It's just a space. And you've learned how to move inside space. Without rushing. Without escaping. Without filling it with distractions or declarations. This is what the crisis was shaping all along. Jung didn't speak of transformation as something neat or linear. He spoke of wholeness, and wholeness includes contradiction. You stop trying to purify your experience into a single emotion. You let it be layered now. You carry peace and unease in the same breath. You hold your strength without pretending your softness is gone. You grieve and rebuild at once. This, more than anything, is the real sign that you've crossed the threshold. Your need to explain yourself dissolves. You're no longer interested in being understood by everyone. You know the depth you carry won't always translate. It wasn't made for applause. It was forged in silence. The silence you stayed with when everything in you wanted to run. And in that silence, you found a voice you didn't know you had. Not the voice that performs or persuades. The voice that holds, that listens, that chooses. You don't speak just to fill space anymore. You speak when it aligns. And when it doesn't, you let the stillness speak for you. The weight you once felt, the pressure to fix, to hurry, to hold everything together, has lessened. Not because the world is lighter, but because you're stronger in a different way now. The kind of strength that bends without breaking, that pauses instead of panicking, that responds instead of reacting, and sometimes doesn't respond at all because not every energy deserves your presence. You start to notice the beauty in what you once avoided. The empty room, the slow day, the long pause in a conversation. You're not trying to escape these spaces anymore. You're learning to rest inside them. You trust your timing. You trust your intuition. You trust the part of you that knows before you know, not because it's loud, but because it's still. And with that stillness comes a different kind of clarity, one that doesn't always have words, but always has weight. You feel it in your chest, in your breath, in your bones. You know when something is right, not because it makes sense, but because it feels like peace. And you know when something is wrong, not because it's dramatic, but because it fractures your energy. So you choose differently now, not out of fear, out of truth, not to impress, but to remain intact. You don't chase connection. You don't convince. You don't contort. What meant for you feels natural now. And what isn't? You release without resentment. Not because it didn't matter, but because you matter more. This isn't detachment. It's embodiment. It's the lived result of everything the crisis asked you to give up, and the strange gift it left behind, the ability to stay with yourself no matter what shape the world takes. You don't call it awakening anymore. You don't need the label. You just live closer to the root of things now. You've simplified. You've slowed. You've stopped demanding life be loud to feel alive. You've learned how to hear the quiet pulse of real presence, how to trust that a gentle knowing can be more powerful than 1,000 decisions made in fear. The transition didn't reward you with clarity in the way you expected. It gave you something better, trust in your own process. Not the kind of trust that says everything will be fine. The kind that says, even if it's not, I'll meet it as I am. That is what the crisis was carving out. The capacity to stand inside complexity without abandoning yourself again. And maybe that's the truest transformation. Not that you changed into someone new, but that you stayed with yourself long enough to finally become someone real. Not polished, not finished, just real. You still fall sometimes, but now you land faster. You don't spiral for days. You return to yourself quicker. You forgive yourself deeper. You don't shame the regression. You recognize the rhythm, the spiral that deepens every time you circle back with more awareness, more softness, more space. The world outside may never reflect what has changed inside you, but that's no longer the measure. You carry it in the way you breathe, in the way you pause, in the way you choose stillness over performance, in the way you say no and mean it, in the way you say yes without apology. No one may notice, but you do. You feel it when you wake up. The way your body no longer braces against the day. The way your heart doesn't shrink when you're alone. The way you meet yourself in the mirror, not with judgment, but with recognition. You cross something sacred. And no, it didn't look like a milestone. It looked like exhaustion, silence, grief, and months of confusion. But it changed everything because you walked through it. And now, you don't just know who you are. You know what you're not willing to lose again just to feel safe. That's what the crisis taught you. That's what you paid for. And it was worth every step,